Good morning, everyone, and today is the day we're going to talk about international law for beginners. So before we get to international law, let me update you on a little challenge that I've given myself, and that is to work out every day, starting today. You with me? In all my years of teaching, I've used the case of the SS Lotus from 1927 from the Permanent Court of International Justice as my starting point for explaining international law. In that case, the court gave a fundamental description of international law that I still view as valid today, although a lot of people disagree. So that's my disclaimer for today. In this case, about a collision between a French vessel and a Turkish vessel, the court had to talk about the fundamental nature of international law. And the court said, first, international law governs relations between independent states. Now that's not really true today, because international law governs certain things within a single state as well. Think about, for instance, human rights. But this description, this first fundamental sentence, point more towards how international law is made, or who can make international law. The concept of sovereignty works as the organizing principle of the entire international legal order. Now, the principle or concept of sovereignty is more or less the godwin of international law. In any discussion about international law, international affairs, at one point someone's going to say sovereignty, and that will be the end of the discussion. So then, what is sovereignty? Well, sovereignty is more or less the principle that says a state can do whatever it wants. And now I'm off to lunch. So I forgot to mention that sovereignty manifests itself in two different ways. First, internal sovereignty means that a state can do whatever it wants on its own territory. Could choose its own government, could choose its own economic system, etc. At least, again, that's in theory. Second, external sovereignty means that a state is independent in its foreign relations. It can pursue its own foreign policy, enter into any alliance it wants to, etc. And also, two principles can be derived from the principle of sovereignty, or the concept of sovereignty. First, all states are created equal, at least in terms of the law. The legal equality of states is one of the foundational principles of the international legal order. Now, of course, states may differ in size, differ in population, differ in power, economic or otherwise, but at least in terms of the law, they are all equal. If you are a state, you have sovereignty, and there is no such thing as divisible sovereignty or a transfer of sovereignty to another entity. I'm looking at you, European Union. The second principle is that of the principle of non-intervention. States are prohibited to intervene into the internal affairs of another state. That follows, of course, logically from the very concept of sovereignty and independence. When does a state interfere in the internal affairs of another state? Well, even the assistance of a rebel group through financial support can be seen as an intervention in the internal affairs. Or let's say meddling in the elections of another state. Back to the edit. So how is international law made? Well, we go to the Lotus case again. We go to the very sentence that follows the previous one.
The rules of law binding upon states therefore emanate from their own free will, as expressed in conventions or by usages generally accepted as expressing principles of law and established in order to regulate the relations between these coexisting independent communities or with a view to the achievement of common aims.
Okay, so much to unpack in this very one sentence. First,
the rules of law binding upon states therefore emanate from their own free will.
This is basically the principle of consent. Because states are sovereign, because they are independent, they can only be bound by a rule of international law if they consent to that rule. The second part of the sentence shows you how consent can be expressed, namely in treaties and in customary international law. The third part of the sentence, the final part of the sentence, reflects the goals of international law, namely to regulate the relations between these coexisting independent communities, all with the view to the achievement of common aims. Now, states can of course not escape each other. They're bound together. They cannot escape. If I don't like you, I can just walk away. States cannot walk away from a neighboring state that they don't like. So, therefore, we have rules of law that make sure we can peacefully coexist. But even already in 1927, international law was much more than that. So what can these common aims be? Well, today we have, for instance, transnational organized crime, environment, and of course, human rights. And who knows what kind of other common aims we might come up with later on. So what does all of this amount to? Well, it amounts to what we call a decentralized structure of international law. Because 1, there is no central legislative body. There is no world government, thank God. States can only be bound by rules of international law to which they consent. There is no legislature either in the UN headquarters in New York or anywhere. States are the ones who make international law. Second, there's also no central law enforcement agency in the world. Again, there is no world government, no world police. There is no single state, there is no single international body that enforces the law. States have to enforce the law themselves. The lack of a central enforcement agency isn't all that pressing because the compliance rate with international law is incredibly high. As one of my favorite quotes goes, almost all nations observe almost all principles of international law and almost all of their obligations almost all of the time. The question is, why is that? And that is called compliance theory. I'm not going to go into that right now. Now on my blog, I discuss a lot of international law cases. However, as a consequence of the nature of international law and the fact that states must consent to rules of international law, they can also not be compelled to go before an international court. There is no compulsory judicial settlement. States are not obliged to go to the International Court of Justice. Again, only if they consent to the jurisdiction of the court can actually discuss the case. So the picture I've just outlined is what's called the Westphalian system. The Westphalian system is named after the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, when this concept of sovereignty that I've been talking about this whole video was basically formalized. Borders were recognized, exclusive jurisdiction of your own territory was recognized. Now, however, though, why Lotus is criticized, why this Westphalian system is now criticized, is because we now have so many different aspects that are undermining that system, undermining sovereignty. For instance, we now have international organizations that play a big role in international law and international relations. And we have the individual who is now a subject through human rights. Our problems these days are transnational. The actors that are involved these days are transnational. I don't think I've ever mentioned terrorists and terrorism in this video yet. We have transboundary pollution. The environment is a concern for everyone. And the question is, how does this rigid, formal Westphalian system going to be able to respond? So next week I'm going to the International Criminal Court, courtesy of a former student of mine. And in the next video I will try to tell you something about the International Criminal Court and let's see what I'll be able to film.